Hi, and welcome to the BSP Software podcast channel. My name is Andrew Weiss. Thank you for joining today. This is podcast episode number 20. This will be the last podcast of the year as we close out 2010 and ring in 2011. We set out to do 20 podcasts this year, and I'm happy to report that we did all 20 of them. We also set out to change things up a little bit. We heard from a number of different voices from our development staff, as well as some of our support techs, and even some sales representatives joined in the fun. We also try to change up the podcast and do some tips and tricks on Report Studio, Query Studio, Cognos Connection, just other Cognos products, not necessarily BSP products. And that's been well received by the community. For our next mailer, we're going to send a survey out, and I would appreciate it if you take a few minutes to answer that survey to gain a little feedback from the community about what you like, what you dislike, what you'd like to see more of in 2011. So thank you for your support throughout the year, and without further ado, let's move into podcast episode 20. So in this podcast, what I want to demonstrate is a technique and give away some samples and some code so that you can recreate this, but a technique to display images in a Report Studio report that include images where the images are actually stored in the database as binary fields in the database. So this is the report that we're looking at here. I got a bunch of products, lawnmowers, some knives. Had some fun pulling some images off of Google and shoving them into a database here. We can purchase slippers or purchase engineers or chainsaws. And these images are stored in the database. I'm showing them in a report that I authored in Report Studio. So this will be our goal. This is what we're going to try to build. Let's start by having a look at our database. So you can see this is a very simple database in SQL Server 2005. I'm going to include the database, our framework manager model, and the report spec of the report that I built, all in samples that you can download right from the podcast channel. Just look for the little link that says download files associated with this podcast. So in this image example database, we have one single table, products table, which has an ID, a name, and then product image, where that's a var binary of size max. If you take a look at that table, you can see that just about 9 products or so and some images grabbed off of Google Images and shoved into the database. So we're going to have to go through a few gestures here to set up this sample. The first thing we need to do is set up a data source connection. Obviously, we go to Cognos Administration, Configuration, and set up a database connection to that SQL Server database. Then we got to go over to Framework Manager and model this database. Over in Framework Manager, I imported the single products table and all fields right from the image example data source. And then I created a single package called image example. And I didn't do any special modeling here. I just published this just the way that it came in. So I have my database. I created my data source connection, created my framework manager model, and published that to Cognos Connection. Now I'm in Report Studio, where you can see I have access to my table. And I can drag over and create a simple list report with product ID, product name, and image. Now I run that report and I can see the product ID column, the product name column, but the product image column is empty, and that's simply because Cognos doesn't know how to handle that, or I'm not aware of a way that Cognos knows how to handle it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a simple ASP page to access the database, pull out the image for our product, and put that in our report. So let's go have a look at that ASP page and see how it works, and then we'll come back and we'll see how we're going to modify our Report Studio report to include those images in there. So if you remember, we had a product ID field, and the ID is what we're going to key off of here. I've got this little ASP page that we've written, and we're going to distribute this as well. It's a sample. You'll want to make some modifications if you're using it in a production environment. I'll point that out in a minute. But what imageloader.asp does is it has a connection to the database, and it takes in an ID, such as ID equals 1, and it reads that image field out of the database. It then returns that image as a type image to the browser. So if I pass in ID equals 2, it pulls out the image in field number 2. And then, of course, go all the way up to field number 9, we can start seeing some muscle cars. Okay, so we've got this ASP page. Let's go take a look at the code behind it and see what we're working with. Okay, here we are. This is a classic ASP page, nothing too fancy about it. Of course, you'll need IIS to run an ASP page, and you'll have to be able to execute ASP pages, some newer versions of IIS that's off by default, as ASP is kind of an older technology. But let's walk through the code so we know what we're looking at here, and you'll know what you need to modify, and you'll also realize what's a sample about this and why I said not to use this in its current state in a production environment. We simply read in the request parameter ID, that was the ID equals 1, 2, or 3, and if it's empty, then we're going to default it to 0, which will be a failed lookup there. We don't have any ID zeros in the database. We're going to create an ADODB connection and a record set. We're going to connect to our database. So you can see in here I'm connecting to my image example on my local instance of SQL Server, my user ID and my password, Cognos. So obviously we're going to have a connection to the database. Now here's the first thing that we want to make sure. This, the user that you're going to use to access this should only have access to this information. We want to make sure that this does not open up a security hole, that having access to this ASP page gives us access to just anything in the database. Also, SQL injection becomes an issue. As you'll see in the next line, the SQL we're generating is select the product image from the products table, where the product ID equals the ID being passed in. So there really isn't much in here to guard you against a SQL injection and somebody putting something at the end of that query string, which is a semicolon delete star from some table. So again, this is a sample, this is an example, and use it at your own risk, and if you're going to use it in production, you may want to beef this up a little bit. But I think the example is still applicable. If we are able to select that image, we open our record set. If we are end of file, that means we don't have any images, we didn't select anything, we're done. If we do have a record, then what we're going to do is we're going to instruct the browser that we're returning something of type image/GIF, and we're going to do a binary write to our response, which is the product image field. So essentially we just pulled that image field out of the database and returned it to the browser. The key here that the content type is image/GIF. So again, back over here in the browser, if I look for ID equals 5, we pull back slippers. If we pull ID equals 12, we get back nothing because there is nothing in 12. Okay, I think it's time to use this in Report Studio now. So over in Report Studio, our product image column from the model isn't going to give us back what we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our image loader ASP page instead. First thing we want to do is come over to the toolbox and bring an HTML item over. Now we're going to need a few HTML items to generate the dynamic link that we need in there for an image tag. You may have seen this in some of Dave's podcasts earlier on with tips and tricks in Report Studios, doing tool tips and progress bars, some pretty cool stuff. So using Dave's technique, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in 3 HTML items. Notice I had to unlock the report to be able to do this. The first HTML item is going to be my image tag. I'll say it's an image tag with a height equals 100, and the source equals HTTP IVC dev, that's my local instance, image loader .asp, and we're going to pass in the ID parameter. But the ID parameter we want to be dynamic. We want that to be the product ID data item. So we can't finish our image tag here. We're going to finish it over in the next 2 HTML items. I'm going to pick on the last HTML item. I'm going to close that source tag that we are working on and close our image tag. And in the middle, we're going to take this HTML item, and instead of providing HTML, we're going to actually make its source a data item value. And the data item value it's going to be is from the product ID field. So pulling up this notepad file here, just so you can see the full concatenated string that we're trying to build, we want an image tag that looks like this. So the problem though is we don't want to hard code this number for the ID. So this ID right there, that's going to be the thing that is our middle HTML item, which is going to be driven by data. The ending part of the string is going to be our last HTML item. And the beginning part of the string is our first HTML item. So that's all we've done, is we've created some HTML right on the fly and dropped in something that's dynamic. Okay, so let's give this a try and see if we have our report. Well, there it is. So product ID 1 is pulling out the our Harley Davidson lawnmower. Some knives, some drills, some speakers, some slippers, some engineers, chainsaws, mailboxes, and muscle cars. Thank you for joining us today for this podcast, and thank you for joining us for the podcast throughout the entire year. We really do get a lot of support from our community in picking the ideas for these podcasts and keeping this going and keeping it strong. So from BSP Software, thank you very much.